At the beginning of the session or the interview, I talked a little bit about the discovery in the early 70s of the otter, urchin, kelp trophic cascade, and I felt that that both defined me and my sort of view of nature and my view of ecology. But we've followed up on that to quite an extent in that system, and so I've spent really the majority of my life basically trying to clean up the details of that process. And by cleaning up the details, I mean looking into how general it is, how exactly does it work, what are the functional relationships between sea otter abundance and the structure of the community in which they live. In other words, does it change gradually from an urchin-dominated community to a kelp-dominated community as the otters become more and more abundant? Is that functional relationship track on the same line going up and down as otters go up and as they go down? What are the consequences of a system with and without kelp to other species and ecological processes? And really I have spent the majority of my life trying to answer those questions. And so we've discovered, just to give you kind of a thumbnail of some of the things that we've discovered and found about this system, we found that the interaction, that is this trophic thing we call a trophic cascade, the process that starts with otters as the apex predators in the system, goes to sea urchins and then down to kelp at the base of the food web, is very broadly repetitive or occurring across the North Pacific from at least the coast of Kamchatka, the area that I've worked, which is the coast of Kamchatka, down to the border of Canada and the United States. That's the area over which I've done most of my work. And over that area, it's highly predictable. So it's a widely important phenomenon. We've found that fish populations are strongly impacted by this, coastal fish populations, because kelp is food and habitat for these things. Just as forests are food and habitat for birds, kelp is food and habitat for fish, and so fish populations are really affected. We've discovered that a lot of other species are influenced by this interaction. So for example, I've done some work on gull behavior many years ago, and gulls are predators also in these coastal environments. And when otters are present, these gulls are invertebrate feeders. They feed on urchins and chitons and mussels and things in the intertidal community. And when the otters are abundant, they feed on fish entirely. They don't feed on invertebrates at all. So, if you were to look at a gull in a system with otters and a system without otters, you'd call them an entirely different species just based on what they feed on. We have looked at sort of the ecosystem process of production, because kelp are photosynthesizers. They are the primary producers, or one of the primary producers in these systems, alongside phytoplankton. And so the question that came to mind early on was, does it matter whether you have otters and kelp in terms of the production and the secondary production for other species in the system? And we found that it matters a lot, that virtually everything is impacted. We've done some experimental work where this was done decades ago, where we outplanted young mussels and barnacles into the coastal systems with and without otters. We went back and collected them a year later, and we looked at how fast they grew. And they just grow like the wind when otters are in the system, and they grow much slower when they're not. And that's just because of production and organic carbon in the coastal system that is fixed by this hugely productive and abundant kelp resource that is linked to the presence of otters in the system. We've more recently looked at other predators in the system, like bald eagles. So eagles are very abundant in the Aleutian Islands, and they feed on coastal resources. And so we've discovered that what eagles feed on, just like what gulls feed on, is very much dependent on whether otters are there or not. And when otters are there, they feed on marine mammals. The eagles, that is, feed on marine mammals. They feed on marine birds. They feed on marine fish in about comparable proportions. And when the otters are lost to the system, they feed almost entirely on marine birds, because the marine mammals are less abundant and because the fish are less abundant. And as a consequence of them feeding on birds, they take on higher contaminant loads because these birds are flying all over the North Pacific and picking up pollutants all here and there, whereas these other things that they feed on don't. And so we've learned those things. We've most recently been interested in CO2 and atmospheric carbon dioxide and how important this trophic cascade might be to the sequestration, to the local sequestration of carbon dioxide. And we found that it's hugely important that the pH of the local ocean in areas where kelp forests exist is much higher. That is, they're much less acidic than they are in places where the kelp forests have been lost. And we have been able to show through all of the accumulated data that we've gathered over the years that the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide that's being drawn down into the coastal ocean and turned from carbon dioxide and bicarbonate into organic carbon, into sugars and to sugar products that are part of the living world is very important. I mean, it accounts for, probably 10% of the atmospheric carbon dioxide in the coastal ecosystem, depending on whether otters are there or not. So what we've found is that this little link of species between otters and urchins and kelp, it just draws in the dynamics of the whole ecosystem, that the whole system is influenced in one way or another. Everything we've looked at, we've seen a signature of that impact. And on sort of one final note, it was an obvious question to me from the beginning that if you have strong species interactions, and we have strong species interactions in this system, that you would expect evolution to follow. And so another dimension to my work has been trying to understand what the evolutionary consequences of those interactions have been. And we focused almost entirely on plant-herbivore interactions for a variety of reasons. They're relatively easy to study. And essentially what we have found is that the presence of otters in this system has radically altered the coevolution of plants and herbivores, as you would expect. The basic idea is that when otters are present, herbivores are rare. When herbivores are rare, they have very little disturbance effect on their plants. When plants are not being disturbed by herbivores, they have very little need to defend themselves. When they aren't defending themselves, the herbivores have very little need to develop resistances to those defenses, and so it decouples the coevolution of strong plant-herbivore interactions. So we went to the southern hemisphere where there are no otters, and we looked at those systems. And what we found was that, God, the algae were just full of nasty chemicals. None of them are in the northern hemisphere. And that the herbivores that feed on those algae down there were very capable of resisting those chemicals. They had developed ways of resisting those defenses. And so there came to this view that not only is this species important in an ecological context, but it's very important in an evolutionary context, and that the reciprocity between those ecological processes and those evolutionary processes really has a lot to do with causing the world to look and behave as it does today in that ecosystem. So really, I think that's my story, and in a little bit more detail than what I explained in the beginning. And the things that I've written and the book that I'm writing now is an effort to kind of recapture and recount that in a little bit more of a comprehensive and palatable way.